Hello friends, hope you're doing well. Let's see what we can do about Bitcoin fluctuations. First of all, as a software engineer, I believe in blockchain and digital currencies 100%. I think this change is inevitable. Today we're gonna look at it. Technical charts, predictions, why this crash or pullback happened, why Bitcoin will go up, what should you do? Okay, not much more to say, let's start. Okay, if you remember my tweets from around the end of November, while Bitcoin was around 57,000, I kept saying I am not touching Bitcoin until it clears 61k. Everybody else kept saying buy the dip, buy the dip, buy the dip, but rookie traders and investors do not understand the importance of volume profile. It's a paid indicator for a reason. It puts you ahead of the game. Volume and price are only two indicators that do not lag. Everything else in my eyes is lagging indicators. Since then, Bitcoin dropped from 57k to 40k, almost a 30% drop. While I was waiting in cash with most of my capital. Buy the dip, buy the dip, buy the dip. I will buy the dip when volume profile and other technical strategies tell me to buy the dip. I think it's time for you to subscribe to my channel and learn trading strategies and investing methods. And then time to analyze and decide for yourself. Because at the end of the day, the best decision is the decision you give yourself. As you may see, cryptocurrencies are not doing well nowadays. People are stressed. Then these people try to trade crypto futures. Futures is heaven for losing money if you do not know what you are doing. Especially if you do not understand the importance of stop loss, which I teach in every video. Look at these numbers. Millions of dollars are being liquidated every single day. It's just a crazy environment. Now, let's see some technical charts. As you can see, Bitcoin keeps hovering around this giant volume cluster and trying to hold it. From a trader perspective, I do not see any kind of indication to buy at the moment. If you're a trader, you need confirmation before entering a trade, and there's no such a thing at the moment. Because if it cannot hold this support area, it's likely to fall to 40k and then even to this volume cluster, which is around 34k. But nothing is certain. If I see a bounce from here and entry confirmation, our next target is 55k. I also want to look at it from an investor perspective. Opening the weekly chart. Now, as you can see, it's forming a kind of trend channel. In my eyes, as an investor, everything around 40k would be a buy and hold type of investing. Long-term investment for 2022 and 2023. Because digital currencies and metaverse combinations will dominate markets in the next decade. Now, let's discuss why Bitcoin will go up. As I always say, markets always go up. It does not matter if it's the stock market or crypto market. But the volatility will be always there, especially with cryptocurrencies. So, if you are a crypto investor, you have to get used to the mega volatilities. If you cannot handle the stress, you're better looking for ETF investing, much more reliable and stable, but with lower returns. Scarcity. Let's talk about scarcity. Bitcoin investor Satoshi Nakamoto kept the number of Bitcoin at 21 million, meaning there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in existence. So as of right now, around 19 million Bitcoin mined. This left us with over 2 million to mine. There are estimated over 1 million Bitcoin miners in the world. However, nobody actually knows the exact number of miners. As you know, the price of anything in the world is determined by supply and demand. As you can see, 90% of Bitcoin has already been mined. This creates a significant value for Bitcoin. Mainstream adoption. This is my core argument why Bitcoin will go over $100,000 and there will be a rise in altcoins. As a software engineer, I'm a true believer in blockchain technologies and digital currencies. Change is inevitable. You may slow it down, but you cannot stop it. It is the core of nature, unstoppable evolution. And we see this everywhere. Crypto technologies have been adapted in the last 5 years like nothing else in the world. Much faster than the internet and social media adoption. Major companies, banks, payment services, even governments, adoption and change is everywhere. With all these metaverse concepts, digital currency adoption will be 10 times faster in the next couple of years. Let's talk about why this strong Bitcoin pullbacks happens. Now there's a balance between fear and greed, which creates these waves in charts. Fear comes after uncertainty. Greed comes after certainty. There's a circulation of markets and economies, a very natural business cycle. I have talked about it in detail in my stock market crash or not video. Please check that one for more detail. Basically, QE tapering plays a massive role in this one. Fed slows down buying bonds, as a result, reduces the money supply to the system. Thus, you cannot borrow money as easily as you used to be. Inflation concerns pushed the Fed to raise interest rates in 2022. This is even worse, because when uncertainty increases, the rich will turn to bonds, which is a secure way of earning money for them during uncertain periods. This is one part of the equation. Another part of is regulations. Governments are obviously afraid of digital currencies without regulation. Because imagine this, I can send a high sum of money to my sister who is located in the United Kingdom in 1 minute without any money laundering. How crazy is that? If I was using a bank or a payment service, it would take much longer with higher costs. Plus, all I was doing would be monitored by governments. When I say government, all I think is tax. Was this money taxed? Is it taxable? Can I make you pay more tax? Tax, tax, tax? Please give me a break. Do not get me wrong, I'm not fully against monitoring the money flow, because we need some certain rules in our lives, otherwise it would be a giant chaos. However, all these business cycles, monetary policies, fiscal policies, regulations, tax worries, and the endless fight between governments and digital currencies puts a heavy toll on cryptocurrencies nowadays. But do not worry, nothing can stop this change, it's already happening. What should you do? First thing first, stop checking your investment account 40 times in an hour. Relax and calm down. You should trust the natural order of things. Why are people investing or searching for ways of investing all their life? You may think so because they want to be rich quickly. Not actually. People invest because they want to secure their future. Over the years, you will feel mental tiredness. You will want to live a quieter and a more basic life once you get older. Do you want to do trading and check financial news every single day in your 70s because you did not invest and have no money to pay rent? Absolutely not. This is another reason why people will always keep investing. This is why markets never go down, always goes up no matter what. Facebook CEO Mark said that the biggest risk is not taking any risk. Actually, I cannot agree more with this one. One other thing, putting all your capital and life savings in Bitcoin is not a bright idea at all. Come on, please. Investment 101, diversifying. As I'm a trader and investor, I like taking higher risks and giving aggressive decisions towards some securities. However, not once in my life I invested or traded all my money to a single financial security. Yes, you may get lucky, but the odds are pretty low. My capital is divided into 2 parts, one for investing and one for trading. I do swing and day trading with stocks and cryptocurrencies and get back to holding cash immediately after trades and wait for the next trading opportunity. For my investing account, I take profits due to technical charts, fundamental indications, and economic cycles. I'm planning to teach you everything I know and every experience I've gained in the last decade on this YouTube channel. Okay folks, I hope that you have relaxed by now. The future is bright for all of us, nothing to worry about. Pullbacks, corrections, economical and business cycles are just part of these investing and trading games. All natural action and reaction. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and like the video so that I can grow the channel and bring you much more quality content. Please take care and see you soon.